Silence is not golden. Silence separates us. Communication connects us. We just need to start living in a world where we're telling our stories more to each other. And I think that really builds empathy also. And empathy creates connection. It creates safety. And I really wish we could all live in a world where we all felt safe enough to share our deeper stories.
Resilience often stems from confronting and understanding the past, leading to profound personal growth. Today, we have the privilege of exploring the compelling journey of Becky Ellis, author of the acclaimed memoir, Little Avalanches. As the daughter of a highly decorated World War II combat sergeant, Becky navigated the complexities of a tumultuous childhood shaped by her father's experiences and the lingering shadows of war. Her pursuit of understanding led her to earn a bachelor's in English literature from UC Berkeley and to build a distinguished career in the publishing industry. Now residing in Portland, Oregon, Becky imparts her knowledge through teaching and is a mom to 3 daughters. In Little Avalanches, she delves into the intergenerational impact of trauma, offering readers a poignant narrative of healing and compassion. Becky, thank you so much for joining me here on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
Thank you so very much for having me. What a beautiful introduction.
You're welcome. And as our listeners begin tracking their walk with the Strava app, I'd love to just jump right in because in your memoir, Little Avalanches, you discuss the concept of intergenerational trauma. Would you mind explaining what that means and how it's affected your family?
Of course. When a parent experiences something that they can't articulate, the child experiences secondary trauma when it affects their behavior. And then when they react to that behavior or that experience, then the child experiences their own trauma. So in my family, my father was a combat sergeant in World War II, and he was in the 104th Infantry Division. He was also a rifleman, and his unit crossed the front lines first. And his particular unit had a 300% casualty rate. My father was in consecutive combat for 172 days, which is a long, long time to be in combat. It's a lot of casualty to experience, a lot of trauma. He came back home, 1946, didn't talk about the war. He didn't want to re-experience it, so he thought the best way was to not talk about it. But he carried the wounds with him. He thought about it every day. And he acted out on that experience in different ways. And that affected our whole family. He married 4 times and fathered 8 children. And he was used to replacing people. So he had a hard time emotionally attaching. He wanted to be loving. You could feel him wanting to love and wanting to be emotionally attached, but he just couldn't do it. And I believe it was from his combat experience. So he became an alcoholic. He became a functioning alcoholic. He became a surgeon. When he got back in early 46, he went directly to school on the GI Bill, graduated in 2 years, went to medical school in 4 years. And by the time he graduated from med school, he was married with 3 little children. And he was also an alcoholic, couldn't sleep, kind of the whole PTSD experience, having nightmares, but he couldn't articulate what was going on with him. So he acted out. One of the things that he did, people ask me, give us an example of that. One of the things is he put our family in dangerous situations over and over again. He would go hiking with my mom when my older brother was just a baby, and it would be extremely dangerous hiking. And he would be strapped onto my little brother would be strapped onto my mother's back. And later in life, when I was finally able to talk to my dad about this, he explained that he put our family in dangerous situations over and over because he was trying to prove to himself that we would survive. And if we could survive danger, then we would survive. If we could survive this next thing, we would survive. So over and over, he put us into dangerous situations. Hiking's just one example.
You know, it's amazing to hear you recount what your father went through during World War II, because when we had first started this podcast and first started talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and the suicide rates amongst veterans and first responders, a lot of people have asked me, like, why do you think it has gotten so much worse? And there's been a lot of speculation over the decades why veterans of the war in Iraq and war in Afghanistan have been coming back with so many problems. And one of the things that I would respond was, I don't think that this is a new problem. I think we just had a generation of silence, multiple generations, because it was fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, all fighting in the same war, World War II, experiencing tremendous amounts of trauma, and then coming home and being sent right back into the workplace and doing exactly what you said, not working through the issues, not talking through the issues. How do you feel about that generation of silent soldiers?
Well, I believe that they were silent, but they weren't untraumatized. And they also were not able to not traumatize their families. And I think that silence is not golden. Silence separates us. I think communication connects us. And I am a part of, so my dad was in the 104th, and their nickname was the Timberwolves. And there was a national organization, and I think there's only one Timberwolf left. But the descendants of the Timberwolves have created the Timberwolf Pups organization. And one of the most common comments from Timberwolf Pups is, my dad wouldn't talk about it either. My dad wouldn't talk about it either. There's the rare one whose father or grandfather was able to talk about it, but most did not talk about it. Not all experienced the same impact that I did, because, as you know, from your service and your experience, someone who's a rifleman is going to have a different experience in combat than someone who's an engineer. It's a different situation. Not that it can be just as bad, but and the 104th was in consecutive combat for 195 days. And my dad only made it 172 of those. So I think that, silence was not helpful. I think I witnessed it in my dad, that once he finally started talking at the end of his life, he was 89 when he came to me in my home and said, "Hey, sweetheart, do we have any issues to clear up?" And we had a lot of issues. My dad did stuff like he wanted us to be tough as old nails. So he would have me get my teeth drilled without Novocaine so I could learn to endure pain and be tough. And there were lots of things like that. And we had a lot of issues, but I wanted to know about the war, because I felt from a very young age that although he wouldn't talk about it and he was silent, when asked, he would change. He would become a little bit different. And I could feel this wound he was carrying. We could all feel it. And he was struggling and we were struggling. And I wanted to understand where it came from. So he finally opened up and started talking to me. And it wasn't only transformational for me, but it was transformational, I believe, for my father too. I don't think he ever got rid of post-traumatic stress. I don't think his nightmares ever stopped. I don't think his guilt ever, went away, his survivor's guilt. But I did see a change happen in him, a big change. For example, he would never acknowledge he was in the military. He wouldn't wear a hat or a shirt or anything. He didn't go to veterans meetings. He did not want to be a part of it. He wanted to, like I said, get away from it. And about halfway through our first year of talking about it, about 6 months in, he showed up wearing a World War II veteran's cap. And I thought, what is going on? Have you lost your mind, Dad? But he was opening up. He was, acknowledging his experience. It was really a beautiful thing, really.
That's absolutely incredible. And as you know, with this generation's worth of war that we just went through from the early 2000s until recent years, there are children now coming to adulthood, having grown up in a very similar environment to you. What were some of the coping mechanisms that you started to develop as a child, as a result of your upbringing?
I became tough. I became really resilient. I became really hard-edged. I'm a survivor. And I was trained by my dad, from a young age to handle a weapon and survive. And the challenge for me is to be open and tender, because I can be very guarded, very capable, very competent, but that only has you experience so much of life. There's a lot lost when you can't be open and tender and let people into your world. I never talked about my childhood either. I was trained into silence. I knew we weren't supposed to talk about things that went on at home. I knew, like my father, he was my role model. So I did not talk about it. I had really good friends who had no idea kind of even how I was raised or where I was raised, or that my father was in the military, because I didn't identify as that. I just closed that part of my life down. And I thought I had escaped it. As I became an adult and had my own children, I thought, oh, I've escaped my childhood. But every time my father would visit, I felt like I was holding this life together with Scotch tape. And I'm like, oh, I haven't escaped it. I've been hiding from it, just like my dad.
How did you begin addressing that? I mean, did you have peers that you were able to connect to? Or was this something that you took a deep, hard look at your life and said, hey, this is actually an unhealthy way, and I don't want to raise my children in this environment?
Well, it was my intention to raise my children very differently. And I think I was soft and tender with them. But they are very quick to say, oh, yeah, but you were really strict, Mom. And, I'm like, what? Me? I'm so sweet. And they say, well, you made us all become black belts. You said we couldn't date. I have 3 daughters until we became 2nd-degree black belts. I'm like, but you loved Taekwondo. Yes, we did at first. Though it was when my dad started talking to me about it that I really was able to see him for who he was, without my desires and expectations of who I needed him to be or who I wanted him to be. And in seeing him, I was really able to see myself. And that conversation, the many conversations I had with him, are really the thing that changed my life too, and allowed me to open to my past and my own experience. So I feel like my dad and I kind of did it together.
That's incredible. I love that you really the two of you together broke intergenerational trauma by talking about it. And in your writing, you state, we're profoundly shaped by the secrets we keep and forever changed by the stories we share. Would you mind elaborating on how this idea influenced that healing process for the two of you?
Well, it's about the silence, the secrets that we keep. I believe that a lot of military families live behind this veil of secrecy. There are things that we know that go on at home, that go on in the military, that we don't talk about, right? And I understand where it comes from. My dad said, and he said, combat guys weren't told anything. He said, if we were captured, we would be tortured for information. But if we didn't have any information, we couldn't give them any. So I understand where the need for secrecy, where like the seeds of it are planted. I understand now. But I think that profoundly shapes who we are when we are trained to keep secrets. And I think we start keeping secrets in all aspects of our life, and we start hiding things. And they become these burdens that we carry when we're hiding them. And if we can just share them with other people, it's not that we burden them with it. They're not carrying the burden, but ours becomes lighter, in my experience. And I really believe in the power of storytelling, whether it's through the written word or the spoken word, or just having a cup of coffee or tea with a friend and telling your story, whatever that story is. So I think that's it. I think we just need to start living in a world where we're telling our stories more to each other. And I think that really builds empathy also. I think I felt every feeling you can imagine for my father in my lifetime with him, except empathy. I never really empathized with him because I didn't understand him. And as soon as he started telling me his story, I started really understanding where all this behavior came from. And I suddenly felt empathy for him. And empathy creates connection, it creates safety. And I really wish we could all live in a world where we all felt safe enough, in communities where we felt safe enough to share our deeper stories, because that would build empathy. And I think just more love and kindness in the world, which is kind of what we need.
You're absolutely right. We need more people to understand. We also need to understand as individuals with stories to tell, with secrets that we feel like we can't share. It's really important to be able to bring those to light in a safe and productive way. A lot of the times, I'm kind of the pioneer in this conversation with a lot of my peers because I don't keep it any secret that I now have regular suicidal ideations. It's part of the way that my mind goes because of just years and years of trauma that I did keep secret. My mind now goes to these suicidal ideations. In the past, I used to try to think of ways to suppress them. Originally, it was unhealthy through alcohol, and then also through dangerous activities like skydiving or riding my motorcycle really fast. Just things that would help create a new feeling or emotion so that I could block out the negative ones of these ideations. And as the years have gone on, I've no longer come to fear these thoughts and these feelings that I have. And I just have learned to express them in a safer way to people by talking about them. But I know, a lot of people have grown up like you. We don't talk about the war. We don't talk about, my dad's alcoholism or my mom's abusive tendencies. Like, what would the community think if they only knew? Well, my experience in sharing my ideations is there's so many more people that share what I've gone through. They share my feelings. Since you've started talking about this, what has your experience been?
Every single time I have an event or go somewhere and talk about my book, there are people in the audience who have a family member who's been in the military. They start crying. And it's just such a shared experience, this silencing and this carrying of the burden. And you're exactly right about, we think, oh, what is someone else going to think? And really, people usually think about themselves more than other people. They're not really that worried about you. They're worried about themselves. And I think if we can open up and share, it almost gives them permission to do the same thing. Once we show our vulnerability and we're going to be open and we're going to put ourselves out there, it stimulates and encourages that to come back. That is my experience with it. One of the things that my dad used to do was he had a Harley and he used to put me when I was really little, like 5 years old, on the front of his Harley. And we'd be soaring down the highway. And I would think it would be like a treat because it's just me and my dad, not a bunch of other wives or kids or whatever. And then he'd think it was funny to let go. And I was this small child, and Harleys are huge. And I was this, 6-7-year-old kid trying to steer. I was terrified. I wouldn't go back home and report that because I don't want people to think I love my dad. I feared him and I revered him and I loved him. I wanted his love. I always wanted his love. And no matter what, we want our parents' love, especially as small children. We need it. And I'm not going to go tell a bunch of people what's going on because I want people to love my dad. I don't want them to think he's dangerous or unsafe or crazy or who knows what. So, but I think in sharing the stories, people, are open to sharing their own stories as well. I find that with all across the board with life. Someone's in a difficult marriage and you start opening up to the struggles of your own marriage, all of a sudden we start hearing, oh yeah, me too. Well, here's what's going on in mine. But otherwise, everybody tries to make everything look perfect.
That image that we want to uphold really contradicts the empathy that we can be experiencing for one another. I laughed at the beginning of that story because I empathize a lot with it. And as you know, from growing up amongst a veteran community and seeing that, we laugh at really inappropriate times because we're just like, yeah, we've been there. Thank God we survived it. And now we can kind of chuckle about it. However, I know that experience also had a significant impact in how you experienced life as a young person. It brought fear. It probably wasn't something that you learned to smile about or tell in an anecdotal way until you were much later in life. And, when I know for my wife, she has a hard time being frustrated with me over things that she would, in her mind, deem trivial because she doesn't want to not upset me, but she feels like her issue is not as important as the traumas I experienced in war. And so she'll hold back. And I try to explain to her after years and years of therapy, no, like your trauma is relative to who you are and what you experienced. I experienced war in the worst of humanity, but that doesn't mean that what you have gone through or are currently going through as a result of me having a flashback or a tender moment or a hard moment should be negated. I should be able to hear what it is that you've gone through. Being in this environment of, there's a lot of trauma comparison and downplay of trauma. How do you feel like we can be empathetic towards one another and also, being aware like we're not actually overshadowing anybody's burdens?
Right. Well, it goes to really owning your own story, and how does my story compare to your story? And I really struggled with this with my father. My little problems were completely insignificant. My scraped knee was completely insignificant to what he experienced, during the war. And my father always felt larger than life. So I didn't want to, I did when I was a kid complain to him. But as I grew up, I thought, I don't want to complain about this because what he's gone through, I understand exactly what you're referring to. And in writing my book, I can tell you that even as a grown woman, a middle-aged adult, I had a hard time owning my story and believing it was as important as my father's. I have a hard time today believing that. However, I went through a lot to get that story on the page in Little Avalanches because, the story opens with my story, my childhood story. And it was really hard to make that story as big as my father's combat experience, which his combat experience is also part of the book and part of the story. His 172 days on the battlefield is in there. But it was such a challenge. And I worked with a mentor and a coach to even be able to get it down on paper because I just felt that my dad's story was so much bigger. And, my dad's story is big, but both stories are just as relatable.
How did you come to recognize the importance of your own story in writing Little Avalanches?
Well, it was through a lot of encouragement, as well as a lot of searching for a story like mine. And there's plenty written about the horror of war. There's also plenty written about the glory of war, which doesn't really reflect the reality, I think. But there's not that much written about what happens when soldiers come home to raise families and what happens to the families and just those nuances that happen and those traumas that are passed down from generation to generation. And I was also encouraged by that. I really wanted to give children a voice because I think children don't really have much of a voice in the war narrative. And women don't have a very big voice in it either, but children really don't. And they're really impacted by it. And that also encouraged me to do it. It was hard though. I won't say it wasn't a challenge. There was one point in writing my manuscript where my mentor said, where is Becky in this story? Your father's here. He's great. He's big. He's wonderful. But where are you on the page? And so I laid out every single page on the floor and I went through and counted which pages I owned and which my father owned. And he owned about 70% of the story at that point. And I had to flip that. I needed to own 70 and I needed to give him 30. So it was very deliberate. And it was practice really. And it was that kind of method of saying, no, I need to own my own story. I need to experience it. And, in talking to my father, I'll also say that he started sharing his story first. But once he got really into it, I started confronting him with my story. Dad, why did you do this when we were kids? And I started trying to make connections. Oh, did you replace wives like most men replace cars because your guys were replaced all the time? And we'd kind of go back and forth on it. And he raised me in his likeness. I can be just as persistent and relentless as he can. So there we were, the two of us back and forth with trying to like figure this out. And I think that also helped too, you know, is the back and forth of trying to really understand each other.
I really commend you for having the courage to write this book. I know just from my own family's experiences, when you have a large family, all of this at play, it can seem very uncomfortable to want to tell your story when you're just, one of seven, like I am, right? Like, hey, I'm going to step out and I'm going to tell the story of our family. How has the rest of your family and siblings felt about your sharing of your father's and ultimately your story?
Yeah, that's a great question because my brother and sister, I don't think I would have survived children without my big brother Martin, and so their feelings about it were really important to me, and my mom too. And I made sure they all had a chance to read the book before it was published. And had they not liked it or approved of it, I would have not continued. And my brother ended up with a career in computer technology. And I gave him the manuscript, and he was taking a long time to read it. And I thought, oh no, he hates it. And I was really stressed out. Like I hadn't heard from him for a month. So I called him and I said, okay, what's going on? Are you reading this? And he said, I'm taking my time with it. I'm starting a chapter and I'm realizing what story you're going to tell. And then I put it aside and I remember the experience because I don't want your experience to taint mine. And then I remember it for myself and then I continue on. And I really appreciate and value that because he didn't want my writing of it to color his life experience. And we experience things in a different way. There's a scene in a chapter in the book about when my dad took us to a nude beach. And I was about 9, my brother was about 10. And I remembered more the nakedness and the uncomfortableness because where I was in my adolescence. And what my brother remembered was my dad whipping our black lab. Like that was his trauma from it. So I didn't write about his trauma, from it. And, there's only so much a reader can take also. I can't make my dad like an animal abuser along with everything else. But, so I think that how my family ended up seeing it was this is Becky's experience. And we all have our own experiences. In fact, my little sister, who has a different mom, said, wow, I never realized the last time you saw my mom was when she drove away that day. It just never occurred to me. So I think when, as siblings, we share our experience, if we allow each other room to have our own experiences and them not to cloud our experience, then we can each, there's room for everybody's experience, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I mean, having adult relationships with siblings is way different than having childlike relationships with siblings. When I just had the privilege of spending a weekend with my 2 older siblings for the first time in like 12 years. Since being on this journey, and we were recounting some of the stuff with our parents and our childhoods. And, one of the things that I had never known when I was younger was that my older brother was not in the house most of my childhood. Like it just didn't click because he was always such a big presence in my life, and so when we're sharing these shared experiences, I remember things way differently than they do. And for them, they're able to see me and like, they're just like, wow, like you didn't experience a lot of the harder things that we did. You just experienced some things in a different way. And I'm like, yeah, like I loved the childhood because of the way that I looked at things. And there was a significant moment in my life. So if I was to look back at my childhood self, there were some things that I was just like, don't hold this too hard, or, this moment will pass. There is some green grass on the other side of this fence if you can just learn how to breathe. If you had the ability to go back in time and talk to childhood Becky, what was something that you would say to her?
It's such a hard question because I still talk to her all the time. I pull her into my lap. She's with me. Little Beckaboo. She's right there sometimes. The trauma, we learn to deal with it. I don't know that it goes away. We heal, right? But does it ever really go away? I don't know that. So, instead of being reactive now, I'm like, it's okay. Like, we're all grown up. We can handle this. That's the things that I say to her. And, I guess I would say we're going to get through it. It's going to be okay. In fact, it's going to be great. We're going to come out of this and it's going to work out and it's going to be great. But I still talk to my little child self a lot because all those parts of us, I think, are always with us. We don't leave our experiences behind. They are with us the whole way. And, sometimes we're reactive from a child's place and like, no, you know what? We're not a child anymore and we can handle this now. So,
how do you find yourself talking to your daughters now?
Gosh, my relationship with my daughters is great. And I think after reading my story, whether it's through reading or just telling your kids stories, I think that they have a whole new understanding of who I am as a person in the way that hearing my dad's story gave me an understanding of who he was as a person. And I think our conversations are messier and more complicated, but they're much more open and forgiving. And as a result of that. So, my little sister, Shayna, was drunk on my father's boat at one point in my childhood. And you know how when siblings get together, we sometimes just say, oh, remember the time. Oh, remember the time Dad drove his Harley to the 7-Eleven and blah, blah, blah. Or, oh, remember the time Shayna got drunk on the boat, right? So we say these things. And with a bunch of kids and nieces and nephews around, they're just like, oh, yeah, Shayna got drunk on the boat. But because I didn't allow drinking in my house until the kids were of legal age to drink, they always assumed Shayna was 21 when she got drunk on the boat. It was just a natural assumption. And why wouldn't they think that? And once they realized, oh, your father was an alcoholic and your little sister at 5 years old almost died from getting drunk on a boat in the middle of the night. No wonder you wouldn't let us drink. Like, we understand you now. And we understand where this comes from and the reasons behind it. So our conversations are just much more full and rich and have a depth of understanding to them. And we try harder to understand each other. Why? And I try to say, this is my experience. And I know it's not your experience. You didn't have the childhood I did. So I'm trying to see this from your experience point of view. Can you tell me more about your experience? Even though you grew up in my house, tell me more about your experience and why you have this attitude towards this or this feeling about that, because it's different than mine.
I want to draw the correlation to this modern audience because, people are hearing the World War II, World War II, World War II. Well, how does that affect today? And 2 years ago, or about a year and a half ago, my wife and I were able to go to visit Normandy. And if anybody's ever been to any of the World War II cemeteries, there are massive, massive cemeteries built to the servicemen and women that died in those areas during a short period of time. D-Day being the course of a weekend. Over 9,000 people are buried in a single cemetery in Normandy, American men. For those 9,000 men that died over the course of the weekend, other people returned home and they didn't talk about it. And this wasn't just like, oh, this town in New Jersey is now affected by World War II. This was across the entire states. Husbands weren't coming home. Sons weren't coming home. Brothers, sisters, uncles weren't coming home. Fathers were not coming home. And nobody talked about it. And there became this culture in America that we grew up in, you and I grew up in, as a result of multiple generations passing down the line of, because I said so, I don't talk about it. Don't ask me why, just do it. You didn't, if you think you have it hard, imagine what I grew up with. I'm just trying to make it better for you. And so there becomes this curtness in our society to just shut people down when they start experiencing hardships, regardless of how hard it is, right? Like, oh, I can't get this candy bar because we don't have the money. Well, if you knew how poor I was, right? Like this type of mentality of, I'm going to shut down every complaint you have. But the reason why it still applies is because we still do that. And we have a new generation of men and women that have gone to war and haven't come home, that are now learning how to raise up their own children. And so we want to be able to give these children a voice so that we don't continue to pass on generational trauma into the next generation. Because, there was not nearly as many people in America during World War II. And so now we have millions of people that went through this experience that you went through. Do you have any advice that you could give to some of our servicemen, women, and people that have experienced some of this intergenerational trauma on the importance of giving their children the space to express themselves?
Well, it kind of piggybacks on the last kind of couple of things we've been talking about, which is make room for your child's experience. It's different than yours. My daughter's experience, like I said, is really different than mine. And if we make room for them to have their own experience and us to have ours, and allow them to express their feelings around their experience and make it safe, make it acceptable, make it okay, I think, and not be as reactive, but be accepting. It's so hard for us to see our parents, our partners, and especially our children, I think, without our own expectations or our own desires put on them. It's really hard. But if we can see them for who they are, I think that's how we get there. See them for who they are and what their experience is, without ours layered on top of it. I think that's how we can get to really see them as separate from ourselves. And I think that is the way to get to that place of making room for them and their expression and their experience and all of that.
It's almost like you had mentioned earlier, is like realize that your kids are probably just thinking about themselves.
Yes.
They're experiencing their world in their own world.
Yes. They don't really care what you're doing. I mean, so long until it affects them, and then they do, but they don't know that you've had a hard day or what's going on at work or what your best friends struggle. They don't know. And they're thinking about their own day and their own best friend and their own situation, So it's sort of like, as we're talking, I'm realizing it's this separateness that we need to allow each other that creates the togetherness. It's the separateness of being that creates the connection of the oneness and the togetherness, I think.
That's really beautiful. One of the things that comes to mind as well comes from our space, right? Like for some people that have a hard time forgiving another person, especially somebody in a leadership position. I mean, this is one of the crux of like modern day PTSD, is that we've come to distrust the purpose that we served in, stemming back to Vietnam, right? Like all of the information that has come out. And what I gently try to remind people, and I'll take it back to more of a childhood trauma than a national trauma, is, some of the decisions and acts that my mom did in raising 3 children as a single mother with an undiagnosed, misdiagnosed mental health condition, is it led us into, poverty. It led us into dangerous situations, so on and so forth. And about 4 years ago, I turned 36, so I'm 40 now. But 4 years ago, I turned 36, and I was recounting with my wife, my mom was a grandmother at this age. I can't imagine the decision she had to make as a 22-year-old mom of 3 or a 24-year-old mother of 3. I developed a new empathy for her to realize the decisions that she had to make and how hard I was still doing at 36 years old. So those people, your dad was a person going through his own process. And I think, being able to recognize like people are also people that should be in authority, should have all the answers, don't actually possess that knowledge that we wish that they did.
Right. And even my dad being from World War II, he still was questioning the higher purpose of being there. I think we're always questioning that. It's such a difficult situation. And he was a day after his 18th birthday when he, joined up and sent away. He was a kid, you know. And I think one thing, especially military service members, need to keep in mind is that, well, I try to explain to people, I believe that people that join the military, they don't know what they're getting into. And it's not 3 or 4 or 5, or in your case, 11 years of service. It's a lifetime of sacrifice. It impacts your entire life. And we need to understand that and make room for that and and have compassion for that as well. Because even today, kids going in today, young men and young women signing up today, I do not believe that they really know what they're getting into, because I don't think you can know until you're getting into it, until you experience it. It's an extreme situation. No matter what the extreme situation is, I don't think people really know what they're getting into when they marry the first time either. I think marriage can be an extreme situation, but especially in the military. And I feel like especially service members need to start sharing their stories and start expressing that it's impacting them for a long time, so we can have a bit of a cultural shift and really having more understanding and reverence for the lifetime of sacrifice that is made in a couple years of service. My dad was only in the service for 3 years. It affected his life, my life, all my siblings' lives, all his wives' lives, his grandkids' lives. Like, this goes from generation to generation, as you've mentioned.
I felt like I needed to hear that about your dad, and that message that even as a World War II veteran, he questioned the higher purpose of fighting in a war that we have clearly painted as a black and white war. To know that, it's not a modern day problem. These issues have always existed amongst our society, and that's why it's so important to talk about them.
Yeah, my dad, I can give you a small example too. I mean, he had a lot of criticism over the politicians that were making the decisions at that time and the lack of bombing that was happening. And that he didn't think D-Day even needed to happen. He was very opinionated about it, because he thought the war could have been stopped before then with some very strategic bombing. And he thought that the devastation that ensued was completely unnecessary. But even in moments like you're talking about a higher authority, my dad earned a Silver Star during a day. It was his 15th day of battle, and it was a German ambush. And he earned it by actually ignoring his orders and doing the thing and retreating back off the battlefield and saving some people because everybody was wiped out. And I find that so interesting that, he was questioning the purpose of everything, but he also said we are trained to blindly follow, and we have to blindly follow. But it was in questioning and disobeying that actually ultimately earned him a Silver Star, which I think is quite ironic. So it's very dynamic. It's very complicated. World War II was not straightforward. Was there a great evil people were fighting? Yes, there was, but there are a lot of great evils out there. We don't need to talk about those, but like the purpose, he questioned the purpose constantly into his last breath of life when he was 96 years old. He carried it all the way to his last breath. So
that's absolutely incredible. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with me and our listeners. And Becky, what do you hope readers of Little Avalanches walk away with?
I hope they have a roadmap for conversation. To be honest, adults read memoir like children read fairy tales to practice and learn something. And really, the practice is usually survival. But the practice of this story is also communication, connection, and conversation. And I hope people walk away with more courage to connect and to start a conversation. That's what my true hope really is.
That's absolutely beautiful. Well, thank you so much for writing that book, getting people talking. It's one of the things, the lack of talking, that has led to an increase in the tragic suicide rates among service members, veterans, and first responders. What message of hope do you have for somebody that is currently battling their own demons?
In Oregon, we have an unusually high suicide rate among veterans. And I've worked with the suicide prevention team at the VA here recently. And I had the privilege of speaking with a group of Marines a couple months ago, and most of them were Bush Marines in Vietnam. So, they were tough guys. But now they look like 75-year-old teddy bears. They all look wonderful, but when I walked in the room, I could feel who they were. I knew what they'd been through and who they were. And I encourage them to start a conversation, because I really think those conversations connect us. And I also understand the resistance to share our experience, because one of those guys stood up and he said, "You think you can understand my experience? You want me to tell you because you think you can understand it?" And I said, "Actually, I don't think I will ever truly understand the depth of your experience, but I want to try. I really want to try." And the hope I would give is that there are people that really want to try to understand your experience. So please share it with someone who wants to try to understand. I think that's the hope, is there are a lot of people out there who really do want to try.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you being one of these people that want to try to understand the traumas that we all experience. Where can people find and connect with you?
Probably my website's the best way. It's beckyellis.net. There's a connect tab on there, and there's a way to email me, and I send out a newsletter every month. And my newsletter is actually about the messy, complicated, sometimes funny conversations that I have every month. And I really do want to get people sharing and talking and communicating. Trauma creates a gap of disconnection. And while conversation can't heal trauma, it can bridge that gap, that the gap of disconnection that trauma creates. And we can connect over conversation.
We truly can. And Becky, I am very grateful for your time, and thank you for taking the time to come and join us here on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you're doing for people and getting them out walking too. I'm a big walker.
Absolutely. Well, remember, you can also walk and listen to the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast on Reese Across America Radio. It's ready for you on platforms like iHeartRadio, Odyssey, and the TuneIn app.